Hello everyone. Welcome to Maternal Mental Health Day. We're happy that you are all watching this video. We do apologize for not being able to offer it live. There's been some changes with the way Facebook is doing their Facebook Lives. So we appreciate your patience and happy that you're here with us. So today is a very important topic. It is breastfeeding grief. And the person who is going to do this presentation, who we're very happy that she's here today with us, is Laurie-Anne Muldoon. And Laurie-Anne is a social worker therapist who has her master's degree in social work. And she has worked for over 20 years in healthcare. In her private practice, Laurie-Anne's specialties include pregnancy, the perinatal period, and postpartum, as well as grief and post-traumatic stress disorder. And Laurie-Anne offers her services in both official languages, so English and French. Laurie-Anne, we're so happy that you're here today with us. As we mentioned before, breastfeeding grief is something that a lot of people experience, but there's not a lot of talk about it. So we're very happy to have you here today with us.
Happy to be here. Thank you. So thank you for having me. Welcome to this presentation. It is really full circle. I was telling Nancy that part of my reason for being here is having had this experience. And I think it's really important to talk about. And so I just wanted to clarify perhaps what I mean by breastfeeding grief. I don't know that that's really an official term or if there's like an official definition, because it's hard to find information about this topic. It's not necessarily readily available. But what it really represents for me is this idea that someone who's given birth, a birther, regardless of their gender identity, is really had wanted very much to breastfeed, had expected a way that they were going to breastfeed for a period of time, and for whatever reason, and the reasons are many, the reasons can be very valid, they can be unavoidable, they could be unexpected, but those reasons prevent them from breastfeeding or really having that breastfeeding relationship with their baby in a way that they had wanted. And I guess a bit of a disclaimer for myself. Part of my own personal professional growth is really trying to use language that is gender neutral. And I will stumble and I will make mistakes. And so I interchangeably use the word mother and parent, birther, but certainly I always intend to be as inclusive as I possibly can throughout this presentation. So my story is actually, it was 10 years ago around this time that I had an experience with breastfeeding grief. But I think I'll rewind a little bit because I think you can't talk about breastfeeding grief without really talking about how you came to the decision to breastfeed. And for some women, that vision or that dream started a long before they actually became parents. But for myself, what really crystallized for me this desire to breastfeed was, before I was a social worker, I had worked actually as a nurse. I worked for a time in public health. And part of my role was to give prenatal classes. I did home visits for moms in the early postpartum phase to be able to support them breastfeeding. I taught breastfeeding classes. I knew all the literature and the research surrounding breastfeeding. And I think very early on, I had made this unconscious decision to want to breastfeed when and if I became pregnant. So fast forward to 2010, 2011, leading up to the birth of our son. I sort of updated myself on breastfeeding. I updated myself on the resources that were available to me. I knew it was going to be challenging. I'd seen that, I witnessed that. I was very well versed in some of the challenges. So I really wanted to give myself the best chances. And so our son came into the world, and within a couple of days, things were starting to become really difficult. The other thing I should mention is I didn't have a plan B for feeding. In my mind, there was nothing else for me. What made sense to me was to breastfeed. So I didn't really have this idea in my mind that I was going to need to pump, that I was going to not use formula. And so very quickly, shortly after he was born, things started to, not seem like things were going to happen. My biggest issue was thrush. It never really went away. It made breastfeeding very painful. I consulted a whole slew of professionals, my family doctor, my midwife, naturopath, lactation consultants galore. And after about 7 or 8 weeks of really doing everything that I could to breastfeed, it just was a no-go. It was very, very painful. I was often anticipating the pain associated with it. Sometimes my nipples were very sore and they burned even between feedings, and it just got to be to a point where it was not going to work. Unfortunately, I stopped quite quickly, which in retrospect probably wasn't the best idea, but I wasn't really thinking clearly at that time. And it really set the stage for me in terms of postpartum depression, anxiety. I was in a very dark place at that time. And so the one thing that really kind of stands out in my mind at that time was how little it was talked about, how little was known about it. My partner was off work at that time with me, which I feel very fortunate about. And there wasn't really anything available to talk about this. There wasn't really a space to have this acknowledged. And so, eventually I did seek support from a psychotherapist. I was very fortunate enough to be able to access that pretty quickly, and that was a huge help. And I also did a lot of writing. For me, writing is really a great way to express. And I'd written an article in a local newspaper a few months after that. So I'm really happy to be here to be able to talk about this. So I have some ideas about what I want to talk about. And so the first thing I really wanted to define today was this idea of disenfranchised grief. And so this really refers to a type of grief that goes unacknowledged or is invalidated by social norms. And this kind of grief is often minimized, it's misunderstood, and sometimes it's even completely dismissed by others, which makes it particularly hard to process and work through, because you don't really feel like you have a right, you don't have permission to grieve. The other thing about this type of grief that is important to note is that it's physically noticeable to a woman who's going through this type of loss. There's often painful reminders of the loss, like engorgement, sometimes blocked ducts, and even really dramatic hormone shifts. Feeding a newborn occurs so often, every 2 to 3 hours around the clock. And so there's constant reminders throughout the day and the night that this feeding choice is not within your reach in the way that you wanted it. And sometimes moms will try to pump for as long as they can. Despite sometimes spending, half an hour pumping multiple times a day, there's only, they only yield a few cc's, which, again, is so deflating and can really reinforce the sense of inadequacy or failure. The other thing that's important to note is there's a lot of secondary losses that go unacknowledged. The early postpartum days can make a lot of parents feel really shaky already. And I've talked to a lot of parents that are depending on breastfeeding to anchor them in their bond with their baby. Sometimes they're really wanting breastfeeding to be able to help them lose some of the extra baby weight. There might be less of a feeling of belonging to a particular peer group or a value system. There's a loss of a special fantasy or a dream that they held dear for a long time in some cases. Sometimes even the reactions from family members, friends, or a partner, or even healthcare professionals that will come up really bring up feelings of shame or inadequacy. And it's often not intentional, of course, but it doesn't go unnoticed by the person experiencing them. And even members of the public sometimes feel that they have a right to comment on your method of feeding, which can be especially hurtful when it wasn't necessarily your choice in the first place to formula feed. And I'm sure there's other potential secondary losses that I'm not mentioning here today, but certainly that's a few examples, and you might have some other examples of your own. So Nancy mentioned I specialize in perinatal and maternal mental health. And I thought it would be helpful to provide some backdrop to this important issue. And one of the things that I came across last year was this idea of impossible parenting culture. There's actually a great book, if you're able to if that's something that you're feeling like you're able to do is to read a book. It's written by Olivia Scobie, who's a social worker who specializes in perinatal mental health in Toronto. And the book is called Impossible Parenting Culture. So it expands on what I'm going to mention here today. But I often look at impossible parenting culture sort of analogous to diet culture. So, for instance, logically, rationally, in diet culture, we know that, there's these ideal bodies that are presented in the media. And, logically, we know that, very few people will sort of be able to maintain this kind of ideal body, that there's probably a whole slew of people behind the scenes in terms of trainers and plastic surgeons or nutritionists or whatnot. But, that doesn't necessarily change the fact that, billions of dollars are spent every year on diet culture and sort of trying to attain this ideal. So although the values of impossible parenting that I'll mention here today aren't inherently bad, they can be taken a little too far. They can easily set up standards of parenting that are just unrealistic and that don't necessarily apply to each family or each situation for one reason or another. So I'm going to talk about 3 of those values. There are more, but these ones I feel really specifically apply to breastfeeding grief. So the values are invest upfront and be rewarded later. The value of making every moment magical, and the value of the more you sacrifice, the more you love. So the first value that I'm mentioning is the one of invest up front and be rewarded later. And certainly what I've noticed in my work with parents is that there's really an increased pressure for parents to, quote, get it right with children in the early years. And that somehow, there will be these devastating consequences if you don't follow the rules of parenting experts. And of course, that includes breastfeeding. And really in our Western culture, investing in a child's future starts as early as preconception, when parents make sometimes significant lifestyle habit changes so that their baby will be healthy as possible, which again isn't inherently bad. There's nothing wrong with that. But anxieties, will grow throughout pregnancy, birth, postpartum, as new parents really try to figure out what to do with their baby's eating and bonding, and to ensure that they're smart, that they're confident, they're social and healthy and well-rounded. And when a high bar is set out of society that isn't attained, for sometimes very valid and very unavoidable reasons, can leave parents feeling that they aren't cut out for this, or that their children won't be able to, be healthy in the future. And it's just simply not true. Health is much more complex than this. So, one of the biggest challenges is that parents are expected to parent on multiple timelines. And this is another element of pressure. So you have to parent the child that's in front of you with all the day-to-day problem solving that requires your immediate attention. You're also expected to parent for the child that you want, with so-called perfect brain developments, that they're top of their class, for example. You're also somehow required to parent a child that will turn into an awesome adult. And with breastfeeding, it's somehow an imperative, for example, to ensure that the lowest risk possible that their child develops diabetes, for instance, later on in life. So the right thing to do is to breastfeed. And it's so complex, and there's so much pressure on parents to really parent on these multiple timelines. And not to mention how it contradicts the parenting advice about just being present with our babies or with our children. Alison Gopnik's book, The Gardener and the Carpenter, can help sometimes provide a useful image that I like to share with parents, and that it really encourages parents to liken their role as a parent to that of a gardener. So they can plant and nourish and cultivate a garden with intention, but how the garden will grow and develop is unknowable, just as it is with children. And this is really in stark contrast with this metaphor of parents as carpenters, where they are building their children by following a set of rules and instructions that guarantee a particular outcome, and the feeling that they need to control the outcome of their children's lives can fuel a significant amount of anxiety for parents. The second value is, making every moment magical. So what I mean by this is, it's really the way that we have come to document the growth and the development of our children in really carefully curated ways to preserve our memories, to make sure our children know their histories, to share with those in our community. And this intensive work can really contribute to an idealized vision of parenting that's aggression-free, that's attuned, that's blissful, a blissful celebration of parent-child relationships. And really the idealization of breastfeeding is included in all of that. And although there are some obviously very enjoyable aspects of parenting, and celebrating is fun, the fact that we share so many of these happy performances does tend to encourage us to silence any negative feelings towards children or parenting. And I don't even like using the word negative feelings, but we tend to attribute them as being either positive or negative, but pathologizing quote unquote negative feelings rather than really interpreting them as normal or even necessary parts of parenthood. And we have a hard time associating feelings like anger or frustration or resentment or sadness to parenthood. Many parents feel pressure to demonstrate how good they are at nurturing their children and how good they are at following expert parenting advice, or that they spent a majority of their non-paid work enjoying their children. And so to reinforce a good parenting identity, and social media has given us a way to do this in real time, literally liking posts and photos. So it's interesting to see how social media has provided some great avenues of support and community, especially during the pandemic, while also inciting feelings of guilt and envy. And sometimes the intention of sharing family moments with friends and extended family also risks a certain level of performance too. And the third one, which I find I see all the time, is this value of the more you sacrifice, the more you love. And sacrifice, it has been long been a part of parenting, and it naturally impacts and disrupts how we spend our time, how we spend our energy and our financial resources. And there is a certain degree of that sacrifice, obviously, that comes with parenting. When parents get together, sometimes a competitive edge creeps in about how much we have suffered. And although there's a need to have our sacrifices acknowledged and validated, it can often show up as what Olivia calls a race to the bottom. So who's the most tired? Who had the most interventions to get breastfeeding back on track? Who had to soothe the screaming baby for the longest? And this is a false connection and can lead parents into sacrificing their own physical and mental health. And breastfeeding is no different. I've seen mothers who will pour their heart and soul into breastfeeding, jump through many hoops and endure a great deal of emotional and physical suffering just to try to make it work. And I was certainly someone who fell into that category. And even though it's not working and it's causing a lot of harm and good, a lot more harm than good, is somehow idealized. So caution is really needed when we tell parents that they're better parents if they suffer more. They can artificially boost their parenting confidence, and it creates an unhealthy cycle of reward for often unnecessary sacrifice. This sacrifice and love cycle emphasizes the message that good families are child-centered as opposed to family-centered, where every family member's needs matter equally. So the other concept that I often talk about, which I touched on briefly before, is this idea of ambivalence in parenting. And a lot of parents give me really strange looks when I talk about this. But the definition of ambivalence is this idea of having mixed feelings or contradictory ideas about something. And I often tell people parenting is fraught with ambivalence. And in our Western culture, we tend to be more inclined to associate all of the positive feelings with parenting or motherhood, like joy and satisfaction and bliss and feeling happy and excited. And on the flip side, we have a really hard time accepting that there's a whole rainbow of emotions that are affiliated with parenting. And that's completely okay. Where ambivalence comes in is that we often don't acknowledge the emotions that are simultaneous and yet contradictory, right? So it's the, I love this child more than I ever knew I could love. And at the very same time, I can resent having to give up so much of my own personal freedoms. So it's like that simultaneous, feelings happening all together. And the other thing, that I like to talk about, I tend to apply, a self-compassion approach to working with parents. I think that one of the aspects of that is this idea of family-centered parenting. The culture of impossible parenting centers children's needs, wants, and desires, really the cornerstone of family life. And we can trace that popularization and normalization of child-centered parenting to the rise in these two ideologies, the one of intensive mothering and the one of attachment parenting. So intensive mothers really see themselves as the primary caregiver for the child. Men or partners cannot be relied upon for that. Intensive mothering, overall, is child-centered, it's expert-guided, it's emotionally absorbing, labor-intensive, and financially expensive. Children come first, period. In attachment parenting, there's a lot of can be some controversy over attachment parenting, and a lot of it is very well-meaning. And parents can also overdo it, really believing that the need to meet every child's request at all times, even when exhausted, and even when it's seemingly counterproductive. And really, a child-centered parenting is often touted as the progressive alternative to adult-centered parenting, whereby parents take more of an authoritarian approach to child rearing, setting clear rules and exact punishments when behavioral expectations are not met. But in our modern day, time is our scarcest resource. It makes sense that parents who desperately love their children adopt a child-centered approach to parenting. How better to demonstrate your love than giving your child your scarcest resource, your time and your attention. And many parents of young children interpret constant accessibility to their children as quality time and a marker of good parenting, but is it? And when parents aren't readily available for their children as they imagined, they tend to feel guilt for having their own biological, emotional, or economic needs that create availability, such as getting adequate sleep, having alone time, or putting their child in daycare so they can have money, so they can make money and have time off from the work of parenting. And, if you really look at it, parenting isn't like other jobs. It's unrelenting. At our jobs, our paid jobs, there's protective labor laws that limit the hours we can work to make sure we get washroom and lunch breaks. But parenting doesn't always have a guaranteed end of day. And when children are asleep, there's always, the background noise of repetitive chores and responsibilities that leaves, little time for leisure. And unfortunately, all too often, family systems in place of what we can do, it doesn't support a child-centered approach. There's always a running deficit whereby the child's needs and desires trump every other need in the house. So I'll often talk to parents about really shifting from a child-centered approach to more of a family-centered approach to parenting. And it can be challenging. It can really fly in the face of what's expected of you in your own family or your own culture, and can really come at odds with what you thought you valued before becoming a parent. And this also, relates to breastfeeding. Family-centered parenting is the process by which families come up with creative solutions to meet the changing needs of each family member. And that can look very different from family to family, from day to day, from week to week. It's really not about being selfish or wanting to take away from your baby. It's about saying, me too, and considering the needs of each of his family members as a unit. And this is often what I encourage families to think about. So unfortunately, I'm very sensitive to the fact that a parent's support systems and practical supports have been so depleted during the pandemic. causing more strain on all parents in a given household. But essentially, each family member is responsible for communicating their needs, and the family is responsible for negotiating and then responding to those needs. So this also means that sometimes each family member's needs are prioritized, and sometimes they are delayed or they're unable to be met. And so, for example, babies communicate their need for eating or a diaper change at night through crying, and this interferes with parents' biological need for sleep. Some families negotiate these needs by sharing nighttime parenting duties, either by partners or sometimes other family members. I know that's even happening during the pandemic. And really leaving one parent with extreme sleep deprivation puts their physical and emotional health at risk, and it affects the whole family. So the reluctance to view parent work as real work because it's unpaid, I think, contributes to this imbalance, with many primary parents in two-parent households agreeing to do night duty because their partner works, and really reinforces the belief that paid work is more important than parent work. So family-centered parenting doesn't ignore the needs of the child at all. Instead, it considers their needs in tandem with parental needs. And it's living with other people requires a certain amount of compromise. And so sometimes having these discussions can help sort of alleviate some of that pressure. And at times, adjustments to infant feedings come into play. At the end of the day, it becomes a question of really what is best for the whole family. There's no perfect way to feed an infant. Infant need to be cared for and provided with nutrition, obviously, and those same needs extend to other members of the family. And so when breastfeeding is a choice that's desired and it works and it happens, and that's so wonderful. I'm always so happy to hear that. And if it isn't working, that there's, everyone's health, everyone's needs in the family are just as important as everyone else's. So that's all I wanted to present. I would be curious to hear others' experiences, or if anybody had any questions about what I had said or questions about something else related. I'm very open to answering those.
I really appreciate that, Laurie-Anne. So what we do is, after people have watched this on Facebook, what they can do is post their questions, their comments, their experiences under this video, and Julia from the Ottawa Birth and Wellness Center will be monitoring this. So we would love to hear your experiences. We would love to connect with you, but do remember that when you post something on Facebook, it is open for other people to see as well. The other thing I wanted to say, Laurie-Anne, one really important part of your talk, and it all was important, was that you shared your experience with us. And I really feel that that is something that connects people, is sharing their experiences. I was unable to breastfeed my son because I just didn't have the milk supply. My dad had passed away when I was pregnant, and I felt like my whole body just seized up, and I just didn't produce the milk. And then 2.5 years later, I had twin daughters, and I was trying to breastfeed, not having the supply, and I ended up being hospitalized for postpartum preeclampsia, and breastfeeding just stopped at that point. And I really found your discussion really enlightening and reframing my experience. One thing that in particular that spoke to me was when you said you didn't have a plan B. And I think that's very true for a lot of people who are pregnant and planning to breastfeed. So could you maybe talk a little bit more about how people can be open to having a plan B, or how they can move towards that idea?
Yeah, well, I often say to parents or parents to be, parenthood is this, you know, of course we teach our children, but I think that parenthood teaches parents a lot more about themselves. It really humbles you, and I think that what I say to parents often is, you and your child are a very unique dyad. Um, and and so the needs of that dyad, the needs of that particular family situation are different from others. Because I think that we often have, it's easy to make comparisons, and I think there's a certain rigidity. Oh, there is a huge rigidity in not having a plan B, and that can apply to a whole host of decisions with regards to parenting. I think it's sometimes important to find out why there's no plan B. I know for myself, I had a lot of ideas wrapped up in health. This sort of idea of like, wanting my child to be healthy. I had a lot of, it was a big identity thing for me as well. It was part of my identity, part of my value system. And I think it's important to maybe even just demystify some of those things, because I think like both options are healthy, and both options can still mean that you're a good mom, a great mom even, right? And so I think that sort of breaking apart some of that rigidity and just trying to help them to understand, there's more than one path, to parenting. And a lot of times what I see is this, that anxious part of us that is, worries, that starts to worry about, the health and welfare of our child, kicks in pretty early. And that anxious part can often be very black or white about things, right? And I certainly, have come across that for myself and for people that I've known and that I work with. And I think that can be dangerous to sort of have that black or white thinking that it's either all this or all that, instead of sort of seeing. And I think that the one thing that I did learn too in terms of breastfeeding, I think because it's such a big part, a big question when it comes to newborns, this idea of feeding. And it's going to be a really intense topic for the first 6 months to a year. But it becomes less and less of a big topic. And I think that, trying to look at it from a more global perspective, to say like, this is a period of growth and development as a mother and as a baby, but it's not the be all end all. There's so many things that contribute to good health, if that's the reason that they're really concerned about breastfeeding versus formula feeding. That there's more to being the perfect parent. In fact, perfect parent is when I throw that statement in the garbage. But there's so much to being a good parent that goes above and beyond just breastfeeding. So really trying to sort of like tease apart some of those reasons and to maybe poke some holes in some of the ways that they're being very kind of black or white or rigid about their thinking, but in a very gentle way, because I know it's a loaded topic. I get that.
I really love the idea of thinking about it long-term and globally. I remember after I had stopped breastfeeding, if my child got a cold or if something happened, I'd be like, oh, I hope that wasn't because I didn't breastfeed. If I breastfed, they would have the defense against this, but that might not be true, right? The child might have gotten that cold no matter what happened, or the cough no matter what happened. And I really appreciate thinking about it in the long term. The other message I really liked about what you were saying is the idea that the person who decides not to breastfeed tried, that they didn't not breastfeed out of laziness, or they didn't breastfeed because they weren't informed. But a lot of times people did try different things before they came to the conclusion that they didn't breastfeed. And I really heard you validate people's decision.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's important to talk about that story, with people who are understanding and who will support that person. I think that, and I don't necessarily mean it. Often we hear that and we say, oh, they're just whining. It's not about that. It's a part of your history as a parent. It's a part of your story as a parent. And I think it's important to sort of express that and talk about that with others who are caring and who are supportive, because it is valid, and we learn from those experiences, but we can't do that if we're not able to share them. If it just goes underground and we ignore that it even happened, it's really important for it to be validated. Mm-hmm. Which sounds like an overly simple answer, but I think it's more powerful than people think. And this is part of the reason I was really happy to come here, because I think that this provides, an opportunity to have a wider audience and to have more of a discussion about it, and for it not to be unheard or unseen, because then it just makes women feel really isolated and like they're the only ones, and that this isn't really like a valid grief, because it is, and it can be felt very, very deeply. I've certainly seen a lot of people who have experienced that in a very, very profound way.
Thank you. I love the idea of a story to be told, and even if you can't find another individual to tell that story to, writing your story down. I found that I did that when my kids were small, and I can look back on those things that I wrote and understand where I was at that time. Because sometimes as time passes, you second guess decisions or you wonder why you made that choice. But by having your story so you can see it, you can remember why you made the choices that you did. I find that helpful.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah.
Great. So we did mention that we are doing this in sort of a unique format. Unfortunately, we weren't able to do it live on Facebook. However, we do want people to know that if you have any questions or comments, again, as we mentioned before, please put them in the comment section and we will be paying attention to them. I also have a short little piece that I wanted to talk about. So I wanted to say happy Maternal Mental Health Day to people, and hopefully in the future that'll be happy perinatal mental health, rather than focusing on the maternal part of that. And on today, we would like to recognize the extra stress that pregnant and postpartum and birthing people are experiencing due to COVID and physical distancing. So some of the extra stress and anxiety may be due to job loss or income reduction, loss of child care, isolation from family members and friends, navigating loneliness, homeschooling young and older children. And COVID and physical distancing has also changed the way pregnant and postpartum people are giving birth. So we've noticed some of these things, that there has been changes in the rates of depression and anxiety amongst perinatal people, anecdotally through the groups that we're running. However, there is a couple of studies. One is a Canadian study, maternal anxiety and depressive symptoms before and after COVID-19. And this was a study done in Canada that surveyed 1,301 postpartum people, mothers. And the study found that the proportion of mothers who had clinically significant depression and anxiety during COVID-19 survey was significantly higher than all pre-pandemic numbers that they had. So this study has identified that perinatal people are, there's an increase in clinically significant depression and anxiety. As well, there was a study in the UK done by Pearson colleagues that found the prevalence of clinically significant mental distress increased in the UK from 16.7% to 27.3%. So pre-COVID and physical distancing, the rate was 16.7 for perinatal mental distress, and this increased to 27.3 during the COVID pandemic. We also wanted to mention that we hope that you will please reach out to your midwife or doctor if you need help with symptoms of anxiety and depression. I also wanted to mention that this Facebook Live is part of a collaboration between the Ottawa Birth and Wellness Centre and Women's Mental Health at the Royal. And through this collaboration, we have 2 perinatal wellness groups, one on Tuesday from 11 to 12 and one on Wednesday from 2 until 3. And the format of those groups is a check-in and then a discussion based on the check-in. We also have a journaling as a wellness tool group on Tuesday afternoons, and the next group will be starting up in June. So I encourage you to reach out to register for that. And we also will be starting a Life with Baby program, which is a collaboration with the organization Life with Baby, which is an organization started by a woman who had experience with perinatal depression. And so our Life with a Baby group is a peer-led group for mothers experiencing anxiety and depression. And for any of these groups, you can email me, nancy.mclaren.kennedy@theroyal.ca. And we will be posting my contact information in the bottom of this Facebook Live, so you can register for those groups. So I want to thank everyone again for joining us, and also thanking Laurie-Anne for coming here, sharing your story and your wisdom and experiences with us.
You're very welcome.